Hello. Hello, everyone. I know that we don't have as much time as we might like to discuss this absolutely fascinating set of papers. In the entire program, this was really one that I did not want to miss as an attendee, and I'm so honored to be presenting this group. If you're a speaker, please take the time to center the mic in front of you before you speak. Right, so just to begin, I would like to invite to the podium for their paper, Reconciling Governmental Use of Online Targeting with Democracy, Katja Andrich, and not presenting, but a co-author, Atoussa Kassirzadeh. Thank you.
Can you all hear me? Is that okay? Cool. I'm just gonna set my time and then we can start. Amazing. Hi, everyone. My name is Katja Andrich, and I'm really happy to be presenting the paper Reconciling Governmental Online Targeting with Democracy. I currently work in AI policy, but I wrote this paper while I was still at the University of Edinburgh, where I met my wonderful co-author, Atoussa Kassirzadeh, who's sitting just here. She's a Chancellor's Fellow there, and she's also the research lead at the Alan Turing Institute. In my talk today, I will first give you a brief introduction to online targeting, after which I will speak specifically about governmental online targeting. Then I will talk about the three main anti-democratic worries raised by this practice. Before I conclude with some discussion of limitations and open questions, I will leave you with the governance framework we propose that we believe can reconcile governmental online targeting with democracy. So, what is online targeting? Put simply, online targeting is the customization of online products and services based on user psychological profiles, which are built by machine learning and are based mainly on data gathered through online monitoring. Online targeting is based on the same principles as offline targeting. That is, it is based on the principles of behavioral economics, which teaches us that we can change someone's behavior by changing their choice architectures through nudges. However, online targeting is much more effective in doing so because it allows for audience segmentation and dynamic changes to each individual's choice architectures. Because of this, it is extensively used in commercial spheres and increasingly by candidates in political campaigns. And now, thanks to recent research by Collier et al., we know that governments have started using online targeting. In this research, they discovered that the UK government is combining operational data with commercial data to build psychological profiles of their citizens, to then target them online with adverts in their public policy campaigns. They're doing this through three distinct modes of operation. Firstly, through the minimally targeted mode, which includes minimal audience segmentation and reliance on these technologies, they are doing things like running ads on TikTok to reach younger audiences. The much more concerning mode is the maximally targeted mode. The prime example is a home office campaign, which used Amazon purchasing data to identify citizens which recently purchased candles or lighters online, and then targeted them with fire safety adverts through their Alexa speakers. The third mode is pretty similar. It's the outsourced mode, and it includes the outsourcing of the entire design and execution of these campaigns to the private sector. An example includes a knife crime prevention campaign, which was outsourced to FCB Inferno by the Home Office and ended up relying on some pretty racist stereotypes. Governmental online targeting raises some pretty novel and unique socio-political issues. And we argue that at the core of those issues is the practice's contested relationship with democracy and democratic values. According to Lever, there are three main democratic pillars. First, enabling citizens to be informed participants in lawmaking and electing representatives. Second, upholding citizens' civil, socioeconomic, and political rights. And third, safeguarding citizens' equality and freedom. We raised three main anti-democratic worries, each of which directly contradicts one or more of those pillars in our paper. The first is the transparency problem, then the privacy problem, and lastly, the equality problem. The first problem we raise is the transparency problem. Transparency is crucial for keeping governments accountable and for fostering informed democratic citizens. However, the UK government's use of online targeting suffers from a multidimensional lack of transparency. Firstly, there is a general lack of governmental transparency because the UK government never actually published a full list of these campaigns that it ran. Secondly, there is an inherent lack of widespread transparency because unlike traditional public policy campaigns, these campaigns are only available and visible to a very minor part of the population, that is those targeted, which makes it very difficult to actually scrutinize them publicly. Third, there is a lack of transparency about the effectiveness of online targeting because this is very difficult to measure. And fourth, there is a lack of transparency that results from the opaque nature of the underlying machine learning algorithms. All four aspects of the transparency problem violate Leaver's first democratic pillar, that is, citizens' ability to be informed participants in lawmaking and electing representatives. The second problem we raise is the privacy problem. Privacy is a fundamental human right, which can be understood as the capacity to control our personal information. When our data is analyzed and collected, as is the case in online targeting, providing informed consent is what allows us to retain this control and protects our privacy. The UK government's use of online targeting, however, infringes privacy. There are two aspects to this problem. First, at least in some instances, the UK government has not obtained valid consent from its citizens for the collection and analysis of their data because they failed to provide relevant information. Second, an erosion of privacy like this causes a chilling effect. Privacy creates a safe space for individuals where they can explore their beliefs, their interests, and form their opinions. Such individuals are necessary for a democracy to thrive, but in the absence of privacy, that obviously becomes pretty difficult. So the privacy problem then directly violates Leaver's second democratic pillar, upholding citizens' civil, socioeconomic, and political rights. It also contradicts the first democratic pillar by compromising citizens' capacity to make genuinely independent political decisions. The final problem we raise in the paper is the equality issue. It relates to the potential of governmental online targeting to undermine the principles of equality and justice upheld by democracy, thereby violating Leaver's third principle. There are three sources for this. Firstly, the underlying machine learning algorithms suffer from an algorithmic bias, which we all know. That can lead to wrongful discrimination and exacerbation of social inequalities. The second source comes from the spurious correlations that can be found in the data, which can also lead to wrongful discrimination. And then the final problem is that the governmental online targeting creates a shift in power dynamics within societies. Governmental collection and analysis of data gives governments greater ability to influence and control their citizens, which raises concerns about the potential for misuse of such power. So, what do we do? Obviously, online targeting can be a pretty powerful tool, and it might help in achieving public policy objectives, but in the way that it's done now, it's very anti-democratic. Can it be reconciled with democracy? We believe it can, and we propose a two-part governance framework. The first part of our framework boils down to applying a recently developed AI governance framework by Zuger and Ashgari, which consists of 5 requirements that we believe governments must meet when they're designing and deploying these campaigns. First, they must provide a public justification for using online targeting, which includes providing details of the campaigns they're running. Second, these campaigns must serve equality, which means that they cannot run any campaigns which are wrongfully discriminating against their citizens. Third, they must co-design these campaigns with the public, and there are some really interesting examples here, but I can't get into them in the interest of time now, so if you want to know more, find me later. The fourth and the fifth requirement boil down to implementing technical safeguards and opening this entire system to validation. This also includes obtaining valid consent. The second part of our framework includes the creation of an independent, non-governmental regulatory body consisting of interdisciplinary experts, which would serve as a check on government's power, guide government officials in creating these campaigns, and ensuring that the 5 requirements are being met. At the end, I would like to end with a brief discussion of some limitations and open questions. In our paper, we focused on a single democratic government and a single AI governance framework. This is in part because until Collier et al.'s research, we really didn't know that governments are using online targeting in this way, and we still don't really know for sure of any other governments that are using this because nobody's really being explicit. But future research should definitely tackle both of those things. We try to provide some preliminary insights into this topic, but obviously a lot of open questions remain. For example, should governments use online targeting for national security purposes, or should they use it for countering misinformation or disinformation within online communities? I don't know, but I'm really excited to see how future research will tackle these issues. In the meantime, I invite you to check out our paper. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Katya, for that. I would like to now invite Varun Nagaraj Rao, who will present his team's work, Discrimination Through Image Selection by Job Advertisers on Facebook. Thank you, Varun.
Hello, everyone. I'm Varun, and I'm going to present joint work with my advisor, Alexandra Korolova, on discrimination through image selection by job advertisers on Facebook. Targeted advertising platforms have been widely used by job advertisers, and Facebook enjoys a significant market share. A study conducted by Facebook in 2018 found that 1 in 4 people found a job on Facebook. However, issues of discrimination due to advertising have surfaced and received widespread attention in recent years. In our work, we define a new form of discrimination due to the disproportionate use of people in job ad images by advertisers, which is unaddressed by current mitigations. Before we dive into our work, let me first provide some background about targeted advertising. There are 2 phases in targeted advertising. The first phase is targeting. During targeting, an advertiser chooses a budget and creates an ad by selecting the text, image, and destination page links. Then a target audience is chosen, specifying a combination of 1 or more of their demographic characteristics, locations, and interests. The ad is then run through the delivery process where Facebook algorithmically decides which ads to show to which users. These algorithms leverage machine learning, are opaque, and may be biased. Both targeting and delivery phases can result in discrimination. In the case of targeting, prior work has found that advertisers could misuse targeting tools, including algorithmic audience creation mechanisms, to exclude people based on gender, race, age, and location from seeing job and housing ads. In response to lawsuits and Facebook's own commissioned civil rights audit, Facebook in 2019 disabled targeting based on these tools for job and housing ads. However, researchers found that discrimination could still occur due to the ad delivery algorithm. So for example, prior work by Ali et al. Showed that ads can be skewed by gender solely due to the ad content, such as the text and images play the most important role. As we can see in this example, an ad recruiting a preschool teacher delivered to a 95% female audience, whereas an ad recruiting for the lumber industry delivered to only a 8% female audience, even though the ads were run simultaneously and targeted a gender-balanced audience. To address this, as part of a settlement with the Department of Justice in 2022 in the US, in June 2022, Facebook deployed a new system in 2023 for housing ads, which claims to reduce the variance in the demographics of people delivered these ads due to their algorithms. Facebook promises to also deploy this for job ads this year. In our work, we define a new approach for discrimination that combines targeting and delivery and is unaddressed by current mitigations. This new approach relies on advertisers' selective use of people of certain demographics in images and this is further amplified by the ad delivery algorithm. Our insight is that images play a unique role in online job ads compared to other modalities such as text, and the disproportionate representation of people in job ad images can result in discrimination due to the following reasons. First, during targeting, an advertiser's choice of images influences who applies for the job, as evidenced by social science theories and case law. So for example, an advertiser's choice of only white men may discourage black women from applying. Second, prior work by Kaplan et al. Has shown that Facebook amplifies the skew in ad delivery due to the implied demographic identity of people in the images. So as a specific example, consider an ad running a pair of ads simultaneously recruiting for the lumber industry, one containing an image of a white man and the other containing an image of a black man. Further, suppose that the advertiser targets a gender and race balanced audience. The ads will be delivered to an algorithmically amplified skewed audience, with the ad containing the white man delivered to a mostly white audience, and the ad containing a black man delivered to a mostly black audience. This leads to our hypothesis that an advertiser's selective use of people in job ad images, combined with the bias in the ad delivery algorithm, can circumvent the current non-discrimination protections on the platform. To test this hypothesis, we leveraged the ad library and searched for evidence for stereotypical image use. We used recent data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to establish the demographics of the US labor force, and this methodology is consistent with prior work by Metaxa in 2021. So first, anecdotally, we found many advertisers using people of stereotypical gender in the Facebook ad library. So this is an example of a moving company which uses only men as movers. Here's another example of a healthcare company using only women as healthcare staff. And this is an example of a service and auto repair company where 93 of the 100 distinct images contain only men. So having established this anecdotally, we studied this comprehensively and systematically for all truck driver and nurse advertisers. To do so, we scraped the Facebook ad library. And since the ad library doesn't show results more than a few hundred based on a keyword search, we searched and downloaded all truck driver and nurse advertiser images individually for the 26 keywords, truck driver A through truck driver Z, and nurses A through nurses Z. We then used Amazon Mechanical Turk to annotate the images for the perceived gender of the people depicted. We now provide a breakdown of our results by the number of distinct images. We analyzed more than 4,300 distinct images across a total of 399 truck driver and 302 nurse advertisers. We find examples of extensive stereotypical image use across all ranges. To highlight our overall results, we find that among the advertisers who use people in their images, 57% of truck driver advertisers and 42% of nurse advertisers use people of stereotypical gender. We now restrict our analysis to advertisers who use at least 15 distinct images, using the number of distinct images as a proxy for the effort and thought that the advertisers put into the visual messaging of their campaign. We plot the fraction of advertisers whose percentage of stereotypical image use among distinct images depicting people exceeds a certain value. As we can see, the stereotypical image use is prevalent among these advertisers. As a specific example, we find that for more than 3/4 truck driver advertisers and 1/3 nurse advertisers, more than 75% of their images contain people of stereotypical gender. Broadly, we find that even among advertisers who've invested significant effort into the selection of their images for job ads, the selective use of people in images is very prevalent. Next, we perform an analysis of the perceived gender and race representation among select advertisers across diverse occupations. We compare the fraction of people represented according to the gender and race in the job ad images to the corresponding fraction of people per occupation given by BLS to determine whether an advertiser may be skewing their ads to encourage only specific groups of people to apply for the job. We find that the majority of advertisers overrepresent women and black people. These are depicted above the 45-degree reference line in the plot. And a majority of advertisers also underrepresent white people. And these are depicted below the 45-degree reference line on the plot. Broadly, advertisers may be attempting to diversify their existing workforce across a diverse set of occupations. We hypothesize that some advertisers may intentionally vary image choices based on their specific needs over time. We find evidence of such proactive image selection in Monster.com. In 2021, we observed widespread stereotypical image use across occupations. So as this example highlights, we see that a white man was used for an IT recruiter job, whereas a black man was used for a pipe fitter job. In contrast, during 2022, we observed a single diverse image across a variety of occupations. Our findings imply the need for enhanced transparency for both targeting and delivery phases, and legal protections to ensure non-discrimination. Specifically, for enhanced transparency during targeting, at the minimum, the ad library must enable features to download ad creative images, the budget, targeting criteria across all occupations and for each ad. For better transparency during delivery, we advocate for delivery statistics per ad, which is broken down by demographic characteristics of users. We also advocate for the ability to query for relevance estimator values of the delivery algorithm based on perceived gender and race of people in images and the target audience. And finally, we need legal protections and platform guidance for image use. We believe that this desiderata is feasible given the already existing features of the ad library for political ads, proposals on enhanced transparency by Imana and Edelson et al., and legal protections which exist for the selective use of text. Let me conclude by saying that we've defined a new approach that measures prevalence of new discrimination issues at the intersection of hiring and targeted advertising due to selective image use. And such discrimination has implications for platform transparency desiderata, advertiser practices, and regulations. I encourage you to refer to our paper for a more detailed discussion of our methods, data, and a discussion of the metrics for how we can quantify advertiser practices. Thanks.
That was great. Thank you very much, Varun. Now I'd like to please bring up the team for representation, self-determination, and refusal, queer people's experiences with targeted advertising. And that will be presented by Princess Sampson.
All right. Can you all hear me well? Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Princess Sampson. I just completed my first year as a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania in the Human-Computer Interaction Lab, and I'm very honored to present on behalf of my collaborators, Ro Encarnacion and Professor Denai Metaxa. Okay. All right. So, target advertising is everywhere. Spending on digital advertising is an industry that totals over $600 billion annually. And this number represents 70% of all spending on digital ads. Yet, ad platforms are opaque systems. Almost all of us are subjected to the surveillance of our online and offline behavior and to more automated inference making about our identities and interests. So, what does queer theory have to do with research in advertising? This question was asked by advertising scholar Stephen Cates in 1999, exploring representation of gay men in print media. I'll note that 1999 is before I was born. And to answer this question for ourselves and motivate this project a little bit further, queer individuals and communities experience social, political, and economic marginalization that I apologize. Queer individuals experience social, political, and economic marginalization that makes them very tuned to issues of privacy, classification, and representation. And this gives them a particularly useful perspective on algorithmic systems that purport to understand things about people and their desires. So, on our agenda today, we're going to go over the research questions and method of this project, our findings, connections to queer and feminist theory, and finally, conclusions and future work. So we have 3 research questions. First, how do queer people experience targeted advertising content? Next, how do they experience targeted advertising systems? And finally, what changes would queer people see as improving their experience with targeted ads? In terms of our method, we recruited 18 queer individuals ages 19 through 41 on online communities and via mailing list. With each of them, we conducted 1-hour semi-structured interviews, asking them about their experiences and perceptions of online ads, their perspectives on ad targeting, and finally, ad targeted as related to their queer identities. And then, with the transcripts from those interviews, we went through a reflexive analysis process. On the right, you can see the recruitment flyer that was disseminated. So, in terms of participant demographics, participants self-identified across a spectrum of identities, races, ethnicities, and sexual and gender identities. It's a very diverse set of people, and we're very, very proud of that. So, we have 3 findings related to ad content, ad systems, and alternatives that our participants articulated and imagined. First, representations of queerness in ad content are stereotypical. Next, ad targeting processes harm queer people. And finally, queer people imagine shifts and alternatives related to targeted ads. So, for our first finding on how representations of queerness in target ad content are limited, ad content is overwhelmingly white and straight, and attempts at depicting queer people are usually stereotypical. A participant who identified as a gay Iraqi man said, "It's like the stereotype of what a gay man is, like super dramatized, to the point where I'm like, I don't know anybody who acts like that. I don't know who's relating to that. It's how straight people think gay people act." And this participant gives us one example of how ad content perpetuates in reductive ideas about queer people, while also lacking overall diversity. Participants didn't see overwhelming amounts of queer representation, and the kinds that they did see didn't make them feel good. For our second finding on how ad targeting processes cause harm to queer people, the limited amount of queer ad content illustrates the wider-ranging exclusion and erasure of queer people. A participant who identified as a gay Black male said, "If ad targeting took into account queer identities, I at least feel like I'm recognized in society. But if they don't, I'm reminded that I'm left out, that many people do not accept me for who I am." In other words, if you're excluded from society at large, there's probably a lot of ad content that a lot of ad content that reflects your identity or your interest. Still for the second finding on how ad targeting processes cause harm to queer people, the binary gender norms that dominate ad content and consumer segmentation lead to misrepresentation. A participant who identified as white and non-binary said, "I feel the misrepresentation the most when it has to do with babies. And I feel like those ads are always very gendered, very targeted towards women and society's idea of what a mother or a woman is. Those ads make me feel very weird." This participant is not a woman, but the products and images pushed toward them by advertising systems reflect gender norms. Essentially, they're being misgendered. But instead of navigating a person's assumptions, it's those of an algorithmic system trained on harmful gender norms and stereotypes. And for our third finding on shifts and alternatives, participants wanted more diversity, coupled with decreases in surveillance. A participant who identified as queer, non-binary, and Latinx/Filipino said, "It's scary how much we're already monitored and how much ad systems know about me. I'd prefer increasing the amounts of diversity within ads without necessarily needing to know for sure if someone identifies a certain way." This participant and many others presented the idea that more diverse content in relation to race, gender, identity, etc., doesn't automatically mean better targeting. If ads have to be everywhere, we could all benefit from more diverse content. Still, for our third finding, participants valued more organic methods of advertising. A participant identified as Turkish, queer, and non-binary said, "Get rid of targeted ads. I feel like people around me don't shop based on seeing whatever is available in the ads. Instead, they buy things because they become popular or when a curator promotes an item." It's not that our participants didn't value the explorative power of advertising in the internet at large, but they valued organic discovery from sources or groups that they trusted, not having ads pushed at them. Most of our participants avoided interacting with targeted ads whenever possible. And finally, participants imagined what it would look like to opt out of targeted advertising. A participant identified as panromantic asexual, Chinese American, and non-binary said, "The default should be that people opt out, and every website should be very transparent and give people options and explanations about what kind of information they want. I don't really consider it a choice if it's like you have to agree to targeted ads or you can't use the platform." As they shared their experiences, our participants began to reimagine ad systems. They pointed out how current revenue models violate their consent and their autonomy. It's not really a choice when you can't say no. And now we're going to connect some of the things that participants shared to queer and feminist theory. So let's visualize our findings with an iceberg. The topmost one requires the most moderate reform, and the last and deepest, the most radical change. Recall the participant who said that their ad content reflected that it's somewhat how straight people think gay people act. But normative or stereotypical ideas also exert pressure on marginalized people to conform and perform. Stereotypes and exclusion in ad content reflect homonormativity. Coined by Lisa Duggan, this describes depictions of queerness that are the most palatable to straight norms. These depoliticize queer communities and disguise liberation as assimilation and consumption. Next, at the level of the harms of ad processes. Many participants felt like their ad content reflected how ad platforms saw them, how they felt they were being labeled and targeted, often conflicted with who they knew themselves to be. The classification and surveillance that are integral to targeted ads violate queer self-determination. To be queer involves rejecting externally imposed labels and opting out of binary norms and expectations. How ad systems are designed fundamentally conflicts with what it means to be queer. And finally, recall how the desire for more representative ad content existed alongside participants' overall distrust of ad systems. We identify this instinct as a dialectic, a generative tension that produces a queer and feminist politic of refusal. In other words, what can you imagine if you have the ability to say no? To wrap up and ask more questions, what algorithmic systems would we build if the norm was asking rather than inferring? This project was never seeking a finite binary conclusion. But ads are about more than business. They hold power over how we see the world and how the world sees ourselves. Queer people are already experts at resisting surveillance and categorization. So let's keep asking them what should change, what should stop, and what comes next. Hopefully that will lead to interventions and new systems that are more just, more interesting, and more expansive. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. My contact information is up here, and you can scan the QR code to access the paper.
Thank you very much for that, Princess. Next, I would like to present the presenter from the team who's talking about next up was to be a different team, but Jacob is here. So the diverse perspective, how diverse perspectives, you see, you're great, okay. The slow violence of surveillance capitalism, how online behavioral advertising harms people. This is UC Wu.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Great. Hi, my name is Yusi Wu, and I'm a PhD student at Georgia Tech's School of Interactive Computing. And today, on behalf of my co-authors, I'll be sharing our paper, The Slow Violence of Surveillance Capitalism, How Online Behavioral Advertising Harms People. So broadly speaking, people don't like online behavioral advertising. There's extensive documentation of people's negative responses to OBA, and people's perceptions of how OBA works also feeds into these negative responses. So as a result, past work has tried to increase user awareness about OBA through education or to increase user agency via privacy dashboards and more granular user controls. But this past work presents two key problems. So for one, negative reactions don't capture the very nuanced negative effects on lived experiences that people have. And for another, transparency and education measures themselves can also further burden users. So these negative effects, costs, and burdens that people experience, these are all harms. Harm is both a colloquial and a legal term. Black's Law Dictionary defines harm as an injury, loss, damage, material, or tangible detriment. So if someone breaks your window and steals from you, that's a tangible physical loss that you have suffered. But whereas financial losses and physical injury can be clearly identifiable as harms in a court of law, privacy harms like those entailed by OBA are less well understood and often unrecognized. But these privacy harms are, of course, very real. Some harms of OBA might seem initially innocuous. For example, maybe you're browsing something on a personal device at home, but then it shows up on your work computer and then you're embarrassed. Or maybe you thought you were talking about something out loud with a friend that was like in private, but then you see ads about the conversation and you feel like you're being spied on. Insidiously, however, these small, seemingly mundane events can accumulate into a loss of control over your interpersonal context and this feeling of being constantly surveilled without your consent. In other words, this is a lived experience of fear and powerlessness. Other harms are more evidently harmful. Advertisers make inferences on people's sensitive or vulnerable characteristics, as Princess pointed out just now, and create stereotypical or discriminatory portrayals of them. And these include things like demographic characteristics like age, gender identity, sexual orientation, race, mental and physical health conditions, unhealthy body stigma, and also things like bereavement. So the examples of harms I just gave are wide-reaching and very diverse, and in our work we propose that having a more specific understanding of these harms that people experience with OBA can help us legitimize them in a legal or regulatory context. So we asked the question, how does online behavioral advertising harm people? Through a survey of 420 participants on Prolific, we asked people to share with us a recent privacy-violating experience with OBA that they felt was personally impactful. Broadly, we found 4 types of harms that I'll go over in the following slides: psychological distress, loss of autonomy, constriction of user behavior, and algorithmic marginalization and traumatization. So first, there's psychological distress. We define this as broad negative mental or cognitive effects related to OBA in general. For one, some users felt extremely frustrated with the amount of time and energy that OBA took up in their minds. Some felt like they were being haunted by seeing the same ads over and over again. Others even mentioned time and energy that they lost from receiving physical mail after they were targeted online. And as this last quote reveals, people said it was a, quote, waste of paper, waste of resources, waste of time and energy. Others felt paranoid that they were being surveilled and listened to through their phone and smart home microphones. And we note that while microphone usage has been debunked in both academic literature and popular media, users still feel real paranoia from a perception of it. For example, as this participant writes, it has happened far too many times for it to be coincidence, and all I can assume is nothing is private anymore. Next up is loss of autonomy. We define this as the denial or limiting of opportunity to make your own choices, such as about your self-presentation. This harm can present as private search history showing up in unwanted places where others could see, such as at work. Like, for example, in the quote on the right, the participant shares that she felt extremely embarrassed when lingerie ads showed up on her work computer while she was sharing something with a coworker, and she was worried that this would affect how her coworker saw her. And in the quote on the left, a participant shared that she was trying to help a friend going through a divorce and then started getting divorce attorney ads of her own. And so she writes, "This could potentially lead to misunderstandings with my spouse. What if I was showing them something on my phone and a divorce attorney ad came up?" Next, we define constriction of user behavior as the alteration of user interactions with technical systems in response to other OBA harms. So some examples of this include taking privacy-protecting measures to avoid OBA or altering your natural conversational behaviors. Multiple participants noted taking privacy-protecting measures to avoid OBA. Some, like the participant on the right, removed devices from their home. And this entails a not insignificant amount of time unplugging and covering up all their devices, but not to mention just all the money they lost on buying the devices in the first place. And others, like the two quotes on the left, altered how they approached having conversations in real life. For example, the second participant on the left wrote, I don't carry my phone with me into other rooms if I'm hanging out with someone. I feel the need to keep distant in order to maintain some sort of privacy and to ease my paranoia. And finally, the last type of harm we found was algorithmic marginalization and traumatization. We defined this as harm specific to personal characteristics like demographics or vulnerabilities like sensitive medical information. So as one participant writes very succinctly, seeing treatments for their medical condition in an ad felt, quote, akin to a HIPAA violation. As another example, OBA can stifle a person's grieving process, like the second participant writes. Their grandmother had passed away recently, and they say, I get reminded multiple times a day that I had to lay my grandmother to rest. I see multiple ads a day on Google, Facebook, I'm over it. I just want to be able to mourn and let it go. At this point, I don't want to ever Google anything again. And finally, OBA can also put people in danger by unwittingly revealing information about them. As this last participant, who identifies as a trans man, shares, he saw an ad for a trans pride flag and felt scared that his coworkers would see it. And since he was not yet out to his coworkers, this ad could have put him in physical danger at work. So once again, just to recap, this is the diverse set of harms that we uncovered from our participants' accounts: psychological distress, loss of autonomy, constriction of user behavior, and algorithmic marginalization and traumatization. So across all of these accounts that we read from participants, one phrase kept popping up: it might not seem like a huge deal. Even though people told us repeatedly that OBA disrupted their lives and eroded their autonomy and diminished their sense of self, they still felt like these harms aren't a big enough deal to talk about. OBA is a form of slow violence, which is a term that was originally coined by literary scholar Rob Nixon, originally to describe climate change and environmental degradation, and then was later adapted by Liza Gack and colleagues in the context of OBA specifically. So yeah, these ads are everywhere, and the mundanity of them makes it really hard for users to devote specific attention to fighting it. And today, there is very little recourse for people who suffer these harms, as OBA has seemingly become a fact of life. Even as people want apologies and recognition of harm, past work from me and my colleagues has also found that security and privacy experts continue to believe that these mitigations are unrealistic. So the extended temporality of this slow violence hides a more sinister foundation of social inequality, because the people who experience the small harms of OBA and surveillance capitalism have unequal education, access, and power relative to the experts who end up dismissing them. And so the very least that we as privacy, HCI, and fact researchers can do is support the legal recognition of harms from OBA. As privacy law scholars Danielle Citrin and Daniel Solov write, individuals whose privacy has been violated need to hear the message that law is concerned with the harms they have suffered. Law's recognition of privacy harms tells individuals that their suffering is real and that their suffering is not just a fact of life that should be endured, but harm that should not be tolerated. Individuals can see themselves as harmed. So we envision two intertwined areas of future work that could support this legal recognition. For one, we have aggregated hundreds of accounts in our study about how people are harmed by OBA, but doing this in a more systematic way, maybe through quantitative measurements, could be an interesting path forward. The Brave browser, for example, already calculates the amount of time and bandwidth that you save by blocking ads, and they turn this into a monetary value. And third-party watchdogs can also help aggregate sufficiently substantial numbers of harms from users to present to regulatory bodies like the FTC. In the meantime, it's often easier for users to produce evidence that they're actually taking protective measures against OBA, such as constriction of user behavior, rather than the other types of OBA harms. So another area of future work could thus include documentation of evasive action that people took to avoid OBA. So in summary, in our work, we found evidence of 4 key types of privacy harms arising from online behavioral advertising. We also showed that harms from OBA are a form of slow violence and can be overlooked because of their normalization. And we also proposed that designing tools to facilitate legal recognition could be a promising avenue of harm mitigation. Thank you for coming to this talk today. Please check out the paper and feel free to email me with any questions. I will also be on the academic job market this fall. Yay, thanks.
That was so rich. Thank you, C. And finally, I would like to present the Diverse Perspectives Can Mitigate Political Bias in Crowdsourced Content Moderation, Jacob Tebolt speaker.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jake Tebolt Speaker, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I want to note that a lot of this work was done while I was a postdoc at Virginia Tech. But I want to talk to you today about our research titled Diverse Perspectives Can Mitigate Political Bias in Crowdsourced Content Moderation. Just by way of background, in 2016, the country of Russia, and people working on behalf of the Russian government interfered in the United States presidential election. This is an FBI wanted poster depicting folks that the FBI believes were participants in stealing documents and sharing them and leaking them on social media. But beyond the theft of documents, the Russian Internet Research Agency also orchestrated a coordinated disinformation campaign to influence the voting public in the United States and sway election results. In response to this, many large social media companies started implementing policies disallowing political content on their platforms. But concerns about political content on social media go well beyond the risk of disinformation, right? There's growing concern about risks of political bias on social media and political backlash against companies perceived to be censoring political perspectives. One prominent example of this was the introduction of Facebook's trending topics feature, which was initially algorithmic, then had human curation, and was ultimately shuttered due to critique of routine suppression of conservative political news stories. When companies operate in spaces where they're either enforcing policies that ban political content or posts or advertising, or trying to ensure maybe that they're not unduly emphasizing some perspectives, there's risk of bias because companies frequently use algorithmic systems trained on human judgment to make content moderation decisions. When algorithms aren't sure, these systems often fall back to human judgment as well. In both cases, there's risk of people's own values potentially influencing their decisions about which content to annotate and label as political. So, in other words, our work sits at the intersection of these two ideas. In other words, you are here. So the overarching driving question of our work is how effective are human crowds, at identifying and labeling political content on social media, ideally without producing unfair outcomes. So I want to now quickly tell you about the structure of our experiment, but please know that there's a lot more detail in the paper. I'm keeping it short here today for the purposes of time. We first needed to develop a stimulus set for our participants based on a set of tweets associated with Twitter accounts from the Russian Internet Research Agency. This set of tweets was collected between June 2015 and December 2017, and the authors who created this data set labeled each post according to the type of account that had been posting it. In our data, we also needed to reestablish a post-level ground truth because these prior account-focused labels don't perfectly characterize the content of the tweets themselves. So we labeled posts as non-political or political following a coding scheme based on definitions of political from the field of political communication. Whether a post is political or not is our ground truth label in this case, but we also retain the original account types as labels to sort of interpret political valence of the type of content. We ultimately included 468 participants in our study, and these participants each saw 10 posts. We randomly assigned participants to one of two conditions. On the top here, you are seeing our what we call naive condition, and on the bottom is the industry condition. In the naive condition, we asked participants a simple question: Is this post political? Does this post contain political content? On the bottom, in the industry condition, we asked participants to make a judgment about the content according to Twitter's definition of political content. We also showed each post to, sorry about that. We also showed each post to more than one participant to further analyze crowdsourcing aggregation techniques, which we'll get to in a second. And so now I'd like to turn to what we found. In all cases, these results are statistically significant, just for context here. For the sake of time, I'm going to focus on two key findings and ask that you direct your attention to the paper for more detail. The first set of results I want to draw your attention to are our findings about individual crowd worker judgments and their efficacy at identifying political content. Just to note here, I'm reporting these in precision and recall, and in some cases accuracy numbers as well for the sake of interpretability, and in part because participants saw 10 posts. First, we see that while participants in the naive condition are somewhat successful at identifying political content with a precision of 0.73, the industry condition seems to be slightly better with a precision of 0.79. To explore this further, we also explored the accuracy of correctly identifying this political content according to our ground truth, right? Broken down by the type of account that was creating this content initially. While it seems that the industry condition does seem to help increase accuracy, specifically of identifying liberal targeting content, this pattern goes away for conservative targeting content. Moreover, conservative targeting content is accurately labeled as political at a much higher rate than either liberal targeting or sort of news sharing content. In other words, our results suggest that in both interface conditions, this kind of labeling might be more accurate for some kinds of political content than others, meaning that if this were true and if this were operationalized as a content moderation technique, some types of political content would be moderated at a higher rate. These findings on their face are somewhat concerning, right? After all, if labeling social media content to identify if it's political or not creates unfairness in which political content is hidden or removed, the popular concerns about political bias on social media platforms might be credible. However, in crowdsourcing, multiple judgments about the same piece of content are commonly aggregated to increase accuracy of the overall decision. And so we explored two of these aggregation techniques in our study. The most common aggregation technique in these spaces is called majority vote. That is, a piece of content would be considered political if, for instance, 2 out of 3 people who labeled that same piece of content said that yes, it was political. In our results, the majority vote technique didn't outperform individual judgment, so we're not really presenting those results here. We also explored an aggregation technique that's come to be known as one yes aggregation. So suppose, for instance, that those same 2 workers said, no, this post is not political, but one person said, yes, I think this is political. That in a majority vote setting, that would get labeled as no, not political. In a one yes setting, that means that we take the one yes, right, so to speak, because one person labeled the post as political. Our results suggest that one yes aggregation approaches substantially improve precision for both naive and industry conditions to 0.88 and 0.91 respectively. But again, turning to accuracy across different types of accounts, these results look positive. The one yes aggregation technique increases accuracy across the board in both the naive condition and the industry condition. But I want to draw your attention to something specific. One yes aggregation in the industry condition seems to achieve near parity across types of content. We were curious about these results. It was kind of surprising. So we actually broke down these precision and recall numbers by the self-reported political composition of teams. Participants self-reported as Democrats or Republicans or other, and were randomly assigned to evaluate the same post as other people, which is how we created these teams. There's a lot of numbers here, and this table's also in the paper, but I want to point you to something specific. In general, teams that were composed of crowd workers with diverse political perspectives tended to perform as or more effectively than teams that were homogeneously constructed. So to take a step back, our results suggest that first, individual crowd workers can recognize and label political content reasonably successfully. But there's a big caveat. This individual success isn't fair. Some kinds of content get labeled more accurately than others, creating a risk of political bias. Second, a one-yes aggregation technique that elevates minority perspectives can meaningfully increase the precision of this labeling beyond the rate of individual judgment. And third, more than merely increasing precision, our results suggest that one-yes aggregation teams that incorporate a diverse set of perspectives may actually help mitigate the risk that some political groups get treated unfairly or unduly unfairly in the content labeling process. So in other words, we found that labeling workflow, that listening to diverse perspectives in some cases may be critical for ensuring fairness in data labeling. Now, listening to diverse perspectives isn't new, right? But operationally, we empirically show that the operational value of this kind of inclusivity, we show that there is operational value of this kind of inclusivity in the context of labeling political content. This suggests that labeling workflows that can help ensure diverse perspectives are going to be important for fairness in data labeling. Now, this is kind of a chicken and egg problem to some extent, right? After all, how do we know what dimensions are important for a given context? How do we build these heterogeneously aggregated crowd teams to do this bias mitigation? Here we diversified on political orientation, right? When we were trying to label political content. But when we think about things like hate speech or culturally specific sensitive topics, the important dimensions become much less clear. We think that knowing how to identify and operationalize which perspective is important for a given problem is going to be a really critical path to future work to help mitigate the bias in labeling processes, and a really key next step from our work here. And so with that, I'd like to say thank you to my co-authors, the other members of our research team who helped along the way, our funders, and most importantly, you.
All right, we are close to time. If you have a question, please raise your hand and begin coming towards the podium. I will take at least one question. Please, David, go ahead. I have one for all the speakers after you.
Hello, thank you for such amazing talks, all of this. I didn't expect to come to a talk session named Targeted Ads and actually leave inspired. So my name's David Witter from Carnegie Mellon. My question is for Princess Samson with the politics of, with refusal and queer experiences of targeted ads. I really liked the iceberg metaphor you brought up. I actually want to ask a little bit more about the deeper parts of the iceberg, the refusal sort of options you talked about. I'm wondering if, with sort of a lens of refusal to targeted ads, if you can talk both either specifically about what sort of design or what refusal might look like specifically for design or for policy, and also invite you to connect that, if you want to, back to sort of feminist lenses of refusal as well, because I think that's really interesting. Thank you.
All right, thank you, David, for that question. That was kind of one of the things that I ended up having to condense for time today, but that's actually something that when that came together in the paper, I found it to be one of the richest parts. So specifically in this, when I'm talking about politics or refusal, I'm initially drawing on Audra Simpson and Eve Tuck, that are these indigenous feminists and anthropologists, and they formalized that concept, essentially trying to look at the idea that when you're talking about tracking and assessing and researching marginalized and colonized peoples, for those peoples in and of itself, refusing that can be radical. And then from there, I connected that to Ruhan Benjamin's biomedical ethics work on the idea of informed refusal, which is like this corollary to informed consent, where it's like, you know, sometimes informed consent can end up being a very disingenuous process where there's really no thought put into, okay, what other routes exist for people who do say no to being tracked and assessed and documented. So that's more on what I'm drawing on.
All right, we're at time. However, I do think we have 1 more minute. So I'd like to direct this to everyone, but if you have a question, do go ahead and come up. So Princess and Yusi, you did a fantastic job of surfacing stories of people themselves affected, but targeted advertising, I'm wondering if it is always visible to the people who are directly affected, or if it operates invisibly, and what was your experience trying to ask impacted people about something that can be so pervasive and infrastructural. And Yusi, if you'd just come up, thank you. I'll pass the mic. And then Katya, Varan, and Jacob, you came up with fantastic desiderata and findings for platforms and policy, and we're probably really far from that. I would like to know how big that gap is before the present practice is aligned with what you identified as important findings. So I'll take it in this order. Yusi, and then Katya, Varun, and then Jacob, and then I'll give it to you, Princess, because you had a question already. Thank you. It's about visibility of...
Oh, yes. So one thing we found actually in previous work was that when we asked people to describe these experiences in like detail, there was a common theme of like, oh, I forgot that this had actually happened to me, and I'm like really angry about it all over again. So like, I think even just asking people about these experiences can kind of like get them fired up and like thinking about how it's affected other people as well, which I don't know if that like answers the question. Yeah.
Sure. So in the context of governmental online targeting and this gap between what's currently happening, at least in the case of the UK, because that's the one that's most tangible to talk about, and our proposed framework, I think that it actually might not be that horribly difficult to fill that gap. So one of the things that I mentioned that there's much more to talk about in the talk, but I didn't have time, is, for example, co-designing these campaigns with the public. So there is an example, a pretty successful example of how Police Scotland, for example, did that. Well, they outsourced the campaign to a private agency that then actually went and co-designed a campaign that was targeting mostly men in pretty rough areas of Glasgow and Dundee to sort of reduce violence in these areas. And they actually, through those interviews, figured out how they can create a campaign that would be targeting those kinds of people, but it would do so in a way that wouldn't let them feel marginalized and that would actually get the message across. I managed to create a short video, which was actually what the targeted ad was, and it was pretty successful in doing what it was intended to do, because more than 500 people actually came forward and contacted Police Scotland and actually got into this place where they were like, yes, I want to break out of this cycle, I want to get a better life. So that's just one example of how we could get forward, but it's a matter of actually, getting the government officials in this case to learn more about it and educate themselves.
It's about the gap between the desiderata and the practice today.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot lacking in terms of what we can do and what exists right now. And regulation needs to exist both from the legal sense and from the platforms themselves. Such guidance, I think, exists for text. Our work kind of focused on images, and currently there's no such guidance which exists for the type of images that you can use. And so there's definitely a gap that needs to be addressed. And I think there's proposals and there's suggestions from community as to how that can be addressed. So I think that needs to be done. One thing that we didn't kind of get into in our work was intent. I think advertiser intent is something which is harder to prove. So it's an open question as to what the intent behind these advertisers' use of these images are actually. It could have been deliberate, it could have been a mistake, we don't know, but I think that needs some more thought and potentially some future work in terms of understanding what advertisers' perspectives are and using these type of images. And yeah.
If I remember the question correctly, I think from our perspective, the platforms could implement sort of a one yes aggregation approach today. That sort of thing, platforms are already using crowd workers and human judgment in these kinds of decision making. And so in constructing a task flow that takes diverse perspectives into account is feasible. We think there's a question here of how do you know people's political orientation, in our case, right? Or for broader context, how do you identify who the right people are to build these teams? Certainly in our case, we queried people, we asked them to self-report. You might imagine things like implicit bias tests or other sorts of approaches that could try to quickly capture someone's orientation to a certain set of ideas and try to incorporate that. But we think this is a big space for open experimentation. I think that there's some really important operational causal techniques here that we should measure and study.
Princess, I'm sorry, I'm getting the shepherd's cane. I want to thank our speakers one last time. Thank you very much.